Hey everybody, welcome back to Muscle Car Campy, and we're back with another beautiful Mopar, a 1970 Plymouth Superbird. Before we get into this story though, don't forget, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell up top. Make sure you're notified every time a new video goes live. You know, the Superbird was designed for one reason, was really to bring Richard Petty back to the Plymouth family. He left for Ford in '69 when they wouldn't let him race a Dodge Daytona. So he came back in 1970 and had a heck of a year. Unfortunately, he was involved in a big wreck, didn't win the championship, but he did win 18 out of the 40 races he entered that year. Amazing vehicle. But we're going to talk about what's really misunderstood on these cars and what makes them so special today. Misconception number one is that the Superbird was just Plymouth's version of the Daytona. Couldn't be more untrue. Not one part from the Charger Daytona will work on the Plymouth Superbird. They have different nose cones, different wings, different plugs, different rear windows. It's a totally different car. Yes, similar shape, but not at all the same. They say that this car is still more aerodynamic than a current Cup car. The Superbird's first super speedway race was the 1970 Daytona 500. In that race, Pete Hamilton wiped up the field, cruised to his victory, his first career victory in fact. The Superbird was just superior to everything else on the track. To show you how good the Superbird was on super speedways, it also won the Alabama 500 and the Talladega 500 that year. Misconception number two was that these cars are only good on super speedways. Couldn't be further from the truth. Petty, as we said, won 18 of 40 starts that year, and often he raced these cars not just on super speedways, he also ran them on short tracks. He ran them, even won a race with one on a dirt track, the last NASCAR dirt track race until present day. While the Superbird did great on track, didn't do as well in dealerships. Bill France, kind of afraid of what was happening with all the era warriors, wanted to bring NASCAR back to its roots where people really could see cars that were sold on showrooms racing on his tracks. So for 1971, the new rule was you had to build 1,000 of them at a minimum, or in the case of Plymouth, half the number of dealerships that you had. In the end, they built 1,935 Superbirds for 1970. And to prove they were still Roadrunners. Yes, it still had the Roadrunner horn, the voice of Roadrunner. Big misconception, as far as I'm concerned. People say, well, they didn't sell well, so some dealerships pulled the nose cones off, pulled the wings off, made them look like 70 Roadrunners. And that wasn't really possible because they didn't use 1970 Roadrunner front fenders. They used Coronet front fenders, so you would have to replace the entire nose. If you pull the wing off the back, you'd have to take the stanchions. You'd have holes there where the stanchions were. So no. If you can show me a documented case of a Superbird being sold new as a Roadrunner, I want to see the paperwork. I know it's urban legend. I don't really believe it. One other thing that we touched on earlier was that the Superbirds and Daytonas were banned from NASCAR. Not necessarily the case. They were kind of legislated out of existence. Fine line, I know. But, you know, you could race one in 71 with a 305 cubic inch engine. But no, you know, Petty himself went back to a regular 1971 Roadrunner. And ultimately they started running them with wedge engines, not even Hemis, 426 wedges. They made lots of power. And of course, Petty won the first Winston Cup championship that year, won it going away as well. Logic would tell you that Richard Petty would have been happy to keep the wing cars around for another year, but that actually wasn't the case. In his mind, and he's been quoted as saying, the wing cars were so stable on short tracks and on long tracks that it took away his advantage as a driver. He said it made every average driver almost as good as him. Much more difficult. You know, he said he could be on a track, throw a car into a corner and know he would be keeping it off the wall. Well, with these cars, with the large vertical stanchions, you know, it made everybody a hero. Everybody was a hero in a Superbird or a Daytona. So Petty really wasn't sorry when everybody legislated them so they were non-competitive.
My name's Dan. I'm the owner of this 1970 Plymouth Superbird. I got it about 13 years ago. Fun car to drive. A lot of historical cachet to it, like Jim mentioned. Maybe a couple of things that people don't know about these cars. They were designed by NASA engineers that were part of Chrysler's missile division that were working for NASA at the time. And the Saturn V rocket had been perfected by about 1968, and NASA sent these engineers back to Chrysler. Chrysler went ahead and detailed them to their race team. So Daytona on the Dodge side and the Superbird on the Plymouth side. So when you look at the back of the car, the wing is an upside down airplane wing, as Jim said a couple of times. These almost like stabilizers gave it lateral stability. The wing's flat on top, like an upside down airplane wing, curved on the bottom. With these hex nuts right here, you could change the angle of attack to have more or less downforce. All real Superbirds have vinyl tops as they came out of the factory. Reason for that was to get the right airflow off the back of the roof to the wing. They had to cut the back of the roofs on standard Roadrunners off and weld in what they called a rear window plug. So why a vinyl top? Well, when they got done welding those in, it was Creative Industries that did that for Plymouth. After they got done welding them in, they found a lot of imperfections, difficult to smooth that out for paint. So one enterprising guy on the assembly line said, why not just smooth it out enough to put vinyl tops on all of them? And that's why every real Superbird has a vinyl top. Keeping in mind that Chrysler, Plymouth in particular, wanted to homologate these cars for racing in NASCAR, they had to do this very quickly. All Superbirds are date coded 30 November, whether they were built before or after 30 November. So they could push them out of the assembly line and get them counted by NASCAR for homologation. So on these roofs, if you look carefully, you'll find sometimes Superbirds are over-restored, and they try to sand out or buff out some of the imperfections around the rear window plug. You'll notice there's these little triangular pieces here, and there's this thicker piece that goes back across the back of where the trunk is. That kind of shows you where that welding took place. But if you look carefully, you'll see some imperfections there. Another thing that people over-restore is they smooth out the top of this rear wing. If you look carefully down the wing, you can see two lines, and that is a piece of extruded aluminum that's in the middle here that adds strength to that wing. Sometimes people will have those smoothed down to where it's absolutely glass flat. That's an over-restoration. If you're into that kind of thing. Another thing is because they were in such a hurry to get these cars out, fit and finish wasn't always the best. So you'll rarely find an original Superbird that has the nose cone fitted perfectly to the front. A lot of times you'll see these where they're almost like perfectly fit in. Again, you could say that was over-restored because when they came off the assembly line, there were a lot of imperfections in these cars based on the speed at which they were trying to churn them out for NASCAR homologation.
Tell us about these. These are a little different. You see these on the Superbird.
Yeah, there's another myth thing about the Superbird and the Daytona as well, is that these were put here so that they could cut square holes under them to give the tires clearance. That couldn't have been farther from the truth. They would cut holes under these things to get the airflow under the car up and out, which was another thing the aerodynamicists found would add to speed if in fact they could do that.
Good. You're lessening the air pressure underneath the car.
Absolutely.
A similar reason the 69 Corvettes and 68 Corvettes had side gills cut into the side. The air went under the hood, and that was the easiest way to get it out. Kept the nose planted on the ground.
Another myth is kind of the height of the wing. And like Jim said, the Dodge Daytona and the Superbird have distinctly different wings. I've had the pleasure of being at a couple car shows where there was a Daytona sitting right next to this one. And you could see that on a Daytona, the wing is much more vertical, not raked as much this way. It's shorter, and instead of bowing in, the way the Superbird is, it kind of bows out, believe it or not. And that was all based on what the aerodynamicists were able to find out for how to make the car slicker in the wind tunnel. The other myth about this is, why is it that high? You've heard some people say on some shows that it had to be that high to open the trunk. And really, it didn't have anything to do with that. If you read the reports from the aerodynamicists, the wings were positioned to get the maximum amount of downforce and get the cleanest air coming off the roofs. They could have made it higher if they wanted to.
And these actually, if you adjusted the wing on top, you could actually get way too much downforce. It was actually more than the car needed. Kind of messed up with the tires when they were going up. They would wear the tires out a lot faster. So you got to give them a lot of credit. Back in the day, they tested, they knew they were really going in uncharted territory. They got it right. I mean, these cars flew.
Yeah, a great story is, there's a couple of great stories. One is which Buddy Baker had a Daytona out on the Chelsea track in Michigan, and that he was driving down the straightaway, and they were saying he was going over 200 miles an hour when a deer popped out on the road, on the track. And Buddy said he was going so fast he couldn't move left or right. He just kind of squeezed tight on the steering wheel and kind of closed his eyes. And he goes, he could almost see the deer's eyes in fear as he blew by the window. Car came with a normal jack for the rear, but it also had a scissor jack that came with it. Another piece that you want to make sure if you have in a Superbird, you can see under there, the normal jack is under the tire, and the scissor jack, that's the original, is sitting over there to the right. There are people that make reproductions of those now. You know, if you were getting one of these, that it has all this support structure in place.
Yeah, with all the downforce you were getting, they would probably push down on the fenders without the support inside the trunk. I mean,
you know, for what it's worth, and I don't know if you want to film it, doesn't matter. Here's all the instructions for the jack instructions. So they show you how to use both jacks.
Oh, okay. I love this stuff. This is the kind of history that, you know, you see a car at a car show, you may hear things about it, you read a magazine article, but this is the kind of stuff that you're not going to pick up except on Muscle Car Campy.
There you go. I'm kind of studious about my cars. I mean, I want to know how and why, and I got this little historical side of me that likes history. So how things got to the way they were fascinates me.
And I like the way you keep a couple of spiders inside the fender vents to kind of shock people a little bit.
Well, a lot of people at car shows look under there like, what's under there? And I see so many people looking under there. I said, well, instead of keep telling that story about cutting holes under it, I put some little spiders with magnets on them. And every once in a while, you'll see somebody kind of shocked and move back when they see that, thinking they might be real.
Well, what do you say, Dan? You want to take this thing out for a little ride?
Sure.
All right.
Yeah, a lot of people, back to the myth thing, you hear people think, well, you know, it's got that big old nose on the front. It must be hard to, you know, maneuver the car. I think she's pretty agile for a car this size. And Chrysler engineers, I think, engineered it well. It's a good driving car. I think it handles well, precise enough.
Well, and I think once you get used to having that long nose way out there, it's becomes second nature. It's like, yeah, I mentioned the 68 to 72 Corvettes before. I've had a couple of those, and man, where the front of that car is when you first get in is kind of it's out there somewhere. But once you've driven them for a while, it's not like you don't know where they are anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, you're careful with it. I mean, it is a kind of valuable car, so you don't want to screw around too much with it, but it's not like I'm, getting right on people's bumpers.
Yeah. You told me a really cool story before of how your wife was shooting some iPhone video. What track were you on with this car back in the day?
Yeah, well, back in November, I think it was, or early December, I can't remember. November. Tim Wellborn, famous Mopar fanatic, he's got this beautiful museum and a wonderful home up in Alexander, Alabama. He has an annual gathering of car fanatics, Mopar guys and gals. And this last November, he had one. We went to it, and it was a wonderful thing. I mean, the Wellborns are wonderful people. They're very, wonderful hosts. And they also set up a track day at Talladega. So those who wanted to go with the team with Tim got to go out there and do a few parade laps, and then a smaller group that were maybe a little bit more brave, I guess, were given the opportunity to go up on the high banking on the track. So my wife and I decided we'd give it a roll. I mean, it's like a bucket list experience. Had to give it a shot, see what the car would do. And I think it was about 6-7 laps we were able to do on the track. So my sensations or my thoughts on that were, you had to go well over 100 miles an hour to stay up on the high banking. The aero on the car worked well because it was rock solid. And I mean, this wasn't a race prep car or anything, and I'm not a race car driver by trade. So I mean, you know, there's some nerves involved in that. Your wife's in the car with a cell phone because we weren't smart enough to bring a GoPro. Filming it all. And it was just, the aero stuff works, car was rock stable. And you really had to keep the speed up, especially in the high banking. I mean, Talladega is 2.66 miles long. It's the longest track in NASCAR. It's got the steepest banking at 33 degrees. So if you weren't on the gas pedal, the car would want to start creeping down towards the bottom of the track. So you learn pretty quickly you had to, you know, you had to stay on it and stay well over 100. But what I really took away was, you know, Richard Petty, David Pearson, Cale Yarborough, Buddy Baker, Charlie Glotzbach, all those guys from that era had balls of elephants, because to drive cars like this at over or around 200 miles an hour for 500 miles, you know, door to door,
30-something other cars on the track with them. That's
incredible.
It's no Sunday drive.
No, incredible that they had the endurance and the concentration.